Look at a screen filled with snow. Not real snow. This is a circle of green glass, and across it, a storm of false light is falling. Every flake is a lie. Each bright fleck could be a plane, or it could be nothing at all. A ghost poured into the air by an enemy who understood that the easiest way to survive a missile is to make the missile blind. A young man sits in front of that screen in the dark. His name does not matter yet. His hands rest near the controls, and his eyes move across the chaos the way a fisherman reads a river he cannot see the bottom of. Somewhere inside that blizzard of interference is a real aircraft. It is enormous. It is one of the largest machines humans have ever flown into combat, and on this screen, it is invisible. This is the central problem of our story. How do you kill a thing you cannot see? The men in that small space have spent more than a year trying to answer that question. They have crossed hundreds of miles of bombed road to get here. They have buried friends along the way. They have watched their equipment shattered before they could even fire it. And tonight, or on some night much like it, everything they have suffered will narrow down to this one impossible task. Find the truth inside the noise. Pull it out of the storm. Strike it before it strikes the land behind them. The aircraft they are hunting is the B-52 Stratofortress. And to understand why this matters, you have to understand what that machine meant in the late 1960s. It was, in many ways, a flying contradiction. Designed in an earlier decade to carry nuclear weapons across the world, it was a creature of the Cold War, built for a war that, thank God, never came. Instead, it found itself over the jungles and coastlines of a smaller, hotter conflict, dropping conventional bombs by the ton. It could carry an enormous load of ordnance. It could fly vast distances without refueling. It flew high, often beyond the reach of the guns below. And it came in groups, and when it released its payload, the Earth itself seemed to convulse. To the people living beneath its flight paths, the B-52 was less an airplane than a force of nature. You did not always see it. You did not always hear it in time. You felt the ground rise and fall, and then there was a landscape where a village had been. The Americans who flew it were not monsters. Most were young men doing a job handed to them by their nation, men with families and fears, men who believed, many of them sincerely, that they were holding back a tide. But the weapon they carried was so vast in its effect that it changed how an entire war was imagined on the ground. And here is the thing that makes this story remarkable. On the other side, in those small, dark spaces beneath the green glass, there were people who refused to accept that this machine could not be touched. That refusal is the heart of what follows. We tend to tell war stories through their loudest moments, the explosion, the charge, the surrender. But the truest stories often live in the quiet beforehand, in the years of preparation that no camera records, in the slow accumulation of failure that teaches a handful of people exactly how a thing might be done. The men hunting the B-52 did not arrive at their moment by luck. They arrived through study, through loss, through a stubbornness that bordered on the unreasonable. Think about what it asks of a person. You are told to destroy the most advanced bomber in the world. You are given a missile system designed by engineers far away, in another country, for a different kind of war. You are told the enemy will flood your instruments with interference so dense that your targeting screen becomes a wall of static. And you are told, by leaders who believe in you more than the situation seems to justify, that you will find a way. Most people faced with that would call it impossible. A few do not. What separates those few is hard to name. It is not fearlessness, because the fear was real and constant. It is not certainty, because nobody could be certain. Perhaps it is closer to faith, the practical kind, the kind that says,
We do not yet know how, but we will know, because we will keep trying until the knowing comes. That faith would be tested past any reasonable limit. It would cost lives before it produced a result. But on a single afternoon, in a sky over a narrow strip of contested land, the question would finally be answered. Not in theory, not in a training manual, in the air, with real missiles and real men inside a real aircraft. The invisible would be made visible, and a weapon thought untouchable would fall. The land where this happened has a name that means little to most of the world. It sits along a river that, for a time, divided a country in two. It was one of the most heavily bombarded places on Earth in those years.
The soil there absorbed so much fire that people gave it a grim nickname. And that nickname tells you everything about what it was like to stand on that ground and look up. We will go there. We will walk the road that brought a regiment to that place. We will sit with the commanders who made the choices and the young men who turned dials in the dark. And we will try to understand both the people in the missile pits and the people in the cockpits high above. Because this is a story with human beings on every side of it. But first, before the road and the regiment and the long catalog of loss, we have to go back to a prediction. A few quiet words spoken by an aging leader, long before the missile crews ever reached the South. Words that pointed at a machine most of his own people had never seen, and named it as the enemy they would one day have to defeat. He said it almost as a certainty. Sooner or later, the Americans would bring this bomber to the skies over the North. The question was whether anyone could be ready when they did. The words were simple. Sooner or later, the Americans would send their great bombers against the North. The man who said it was not a soldier by training, but he had spent a lifetime learning to read the intentions of more powerful nations. And he spoke about the future with the calm of someone who had already lived through several. It is worth pausing on how strange that prediction must have sounded at the time. In the early and middle years of the decade, the B-52 was, to most people in the North, an abstraction, a rumor of a machine.
The war they knew came from fighter bombers, from the fast jets that streaked low and struck and were gone. The idea that the Americans would commit their largest strategic bomber, the aircraft built to carry the most terrible weapons across oceans, to this particular conflict was not obvious. Many would have thought it unlikely. But the prediction was not really about aircraft. It was about logic. If the war did not end quickly, and it would not, then each side would reach for heavier and heavier tools. A nation with the B-52 in its arsenal would, in time, be tempted to use it. And when that day came, the people on the ground would face a choice. They could accept that the bomber was beyond their reach and simply endure it. Or they could decide, years in advance, that no weapon was untouchable and begin the slow work of learning how to bring it down. They chose the second path. That choice is the quiet hinge on which this entire story turns. Because a prediction, by itself, changes nothing. What mattered was that someone treated it as an instruction. If the bomber was coming, then the work of defeating it had to begin before it arrived. You could not wait for the first B-52 to appear over your cities and then start figuring out how to fight it. By then, it would be too late. The preparation had to come first, in the dark, with no guarantee it would ever pay off. So a decision was made. One unit would be chosen and sent forward, not to defend a city, not to hold a fixed line, but to do something far more unusual. To go and find the bomber, to study it,
To provoke it into the open if necessary, and in the process, to learn the thing nobody yet knew, which was simply how it could be done. The unit chosen for this was a Missile Regiment. Its number was 238. To understand what that meant,
you have to understand the weapon they carried. The surface-to-air missile system at the center of this story was a Soviet design, known in the West by a reporting name and in the technical literature by its model number. It had already earned a fearsome reputation. Years earlier, this same family of missiles had reached up and plucked a high-flying American spy plane out of the sky at an altitude everyone had believed was safe. That single event had rattled confidence in the idea that altitude alone could keep an aircraft beyond harm. So the missile was capable, on paper. It could reach the heights at which the great bombers flew. The problem was never really the missile's reach. The problem was guidance. The problem was seeing. A missile like this does not simply fly toward a target on its own. It is guided. Radar on the ground must find the aircraft, track it precisely, and feed that tracking to the missile in flight. Take away the radar's ability to see clearly, and the whole system, for all its power, becomes a blind giant swinging at shadows. And the Americans understood this perfectly. They were not careless about the threat. They invested enormous effort in electronic countermeasures, in jamming, in flooding the airwaves with interference designed to blind exactly this kind of radar. When the bombers came, they would not come naked. They would come wrapped in a cloud of electronic noise meant to turn every targeting screen into that storm of false light we began with.
This was the true contest. Not missile against aircraft, but the eye against the blindfold. The crew on the ground straining to see. The crews in the air working to make sure they could not. The men of the regiment knew the broad shape of this challenge when they were given their mission. They did not yet know its full weight. They knew they were being asked to do something that had not been done, against an aircraft most of them had never encountered, using equipment that worked beautifully in theory and had never been tested against this specific, brilliant, infuriating problem of the jamming. There is a particular kind of courage in accepting a task like that. It is not the courage of the charge, the sudden burst of bravery that carries a person across open ground. It is slower and lonelier. It is the courage to commit years of your life and to risk the lives of the men you command to a problem that may have no solution, on the strength of a belief that one must exist. The commanders who took up this mission were not reckless men. They were professionals. They studied, they argued, they tested ideas and watched many of them fail. They understood that they were, in a sense, writing a manual that did not yet exist, page by bloody page, and that every page would be paid for. And they understood something else, something that gave the whole effort its grim urgency. The longer they waited, the better the Americans would get. Jamming technology improved. Tactics evolved. Every month that passed without an answer was a month in which the problem grew harder. The window in which a solution might be found was not going to stay open forever. It might already be closing. So they could not simply prepare in safety. Far to the rear, perfecting their craft in peace, they had to go forward into the most dangerous skies available to them and learn under fire. They had to put themselves in the path of the very weapon they meant to defeat, knowing that in the long apprenticeship ahead, the bomber would have many chances to teach them lessons they would not survive. The place they were sent to was in the far south of their territory, hard against the line that split the country. It was a place where the bombs already fell without mercy, where the war was not a future possibility, but a daily fact. To get there, the regiment would have to move an enormous and fragile collection of vehicles and missiles and radar across hundreds of miles of country that the enemy was actively trying to render impassable. That journey, the long road south, would begin to take its toll long before the regiment ever reached its destination. Some of the men who set out would not arrive, and the first lessons of this campaign, harsh and unforgiving, would be learned not in the missile pits at all,
but on the cratered roads in between. A missile regiment does not travel light. We tend to picture air defense as something sleek, a launcher, a missile, a flash, a kill. The reality on those roads in 1966 was the opposite of sleek. To move this regiment was to move a small mechanical city. There were the launchers themselves. There were the missiles, long and heavy and delicate, each one a precise instrument that did not enjoy being jolted across broken ground. There were the radar vehicles, the vans full of electronics that were the true brain of the system.
There were the support trucks, the fuel, the spare parts, the cabling, the generators, the hundreds of small things without which none of the large things would work. Move all of that as a unit. Move it slowly, because it cannot move fast. Move it along roads that the most powerful air force in the world has made its daily business to destroy. That was the task before they could fight at all. The regiment was built around several firing battalions, along with the radar battalion and supporting anti-aircraft artillery. Hundreds of vehicles in all. Now imagine threading that long, vulnerable column south, through a landscape where every bridge was a target, every river crossing a gamble, every stretch of open road a place where death might fall from a clear sky. The men learned quickly that the journey itself was a battle. There is a story from early in that movement that captures the spirit of it. The regiment had a guiding principle, blunt and practical. When you meet the enemy, you fight. You do not wait for the perfect moment. You do not hold your fire for the mission you were sent to accomplish. If a target presents itself, you take it. And so, on a morning in late July of 1966, before they had even reached the killing ground in the south, one of the battalions did exactly that. Aircraft appeared, the crew engaged, and in that engagement, far from their intended battlefield, the battalion brought down 2 American attack jets. It was a small victory in the scale of the war. 2 aircraft, but think about what it meant to those men. They were a unit sent on an almost theoretical mission to learn how to kill a bomber they had never faced. They had not yet proven they could kill anything at all. And now, on the road, almost in passing, they had shown that the system worked, that the training held, that when the moment came, they could find a target and strike it. That kind of early success matters more than its numbers suggest. It is fuel. It is proof, carried in the heart, that the impossible thing they had been sent to do might not be impossible after all. Men who have tasted one victory will endure a great deal in pursuit of the next. And endure they would. The road south grew worse as they went. There was one stretch, a short run between 2 towns, that should have taken almost no time at all. The distance was small, a matter of a few dozen miles, but the enemy struck that stretch of road with such ferocity that crossing it became an ordeal measured not in hours, but in the casualties it cost. A distance you could drive in an afternoon in peacetime became, in war, a gauntlet that bled the column with every attempt. This is one of those truths about war that rarely makes it into the dramatic retelling. The battle is not only the battle. The battle is also the getting there. It is the slow, grinding attrition of movement under fire. The friends lost not in some climactic engagement, but on an ordinary stretch of road, killed while doing nothing more heroic than driving a truck forward. There came a day in the spring of 1967, before the regiment had even fully settled into its task, when 16 of its men were killed. 16 in a single day. Not in the great duel with the bomber they had come to fight, but in the long, unglamorous business of survival under constant attack. Sit with that number for a moment. 16 lives. Each one a person who had crossed all those miles, who had endured all that hardship, who had believed in the mission enough to keep moving toward it.
And then, on an ordinary day, gone. Not in the moment of triumph they had worked toward, not even in a fair fight. Simply erased by the relentless pressure of an enemy who owned the sky and used it without pause. The men who survived had to absorb that loss and keep going. This is perhaps the hardest thing that war asks of soldiers, harder in some ways than the danger to themselves. To watch the people beside you fall, and to understand that stopping is not an option, that the mission does not pause for grief, that you must pick up and carry on while the loss is still raw in your chest. Part of it was discipline, the deep training that lets a person function even when everything in them wants to stop. Part of it was the mission itself, the knowledge that what they were attempting mattered, that if they could only reach their ground and solve their problem, the lives already spent would not have been spent for nothing. And part of it, surely, was each other. The bond between men who have suffered the same road is a powerful thing. It carries people forward when nothing else can. We should be honest about the other side of this too. The American pilots striking those roads were not aiming at individual men in trucks.
They were attacking a supply line, a military movement, targets that were, by the cold logic of war, legitimate. Many of them never knew what their bombs hit. They flew their missions, took their own considerable risks, and went home to their bases, just as the men below were trying to do their jobs and survive. The tragedy is not that one side was wicked. The tragedy is that the machinery of the war ground up human beings on every level. The man in the truck and the man in the cockpit alike, each doing what his nation asked. By the time the regiment finally reached its destination in the south, it had already paid a heavy price. It had not yet fired a shot at the bomber it had come to destroy. It had simply arrived, battered and reduced, at the place where the real work would begin. And that place, when they reached it, turned out to be something close to hell. A narrow strip of ground caught between fire from the land, fire from the sea, and fire from the air. A place where the simple act of setting up their equipment would become its own deadly trial. They had survived the road. Now they had to survive the killing ground itself. There are places on this earth where so much fire has fallen that the people who lived there gave the land a name to match. The strip of ground where the regiment finally set up its launchers was one of those places. It sat along the river that divided the country, and it had absorbed so much bombardment, so relentlessly, for so long, that it had earned a grim reputation as one of the most savagely contested patches of soil in the entire war. To stand there was to be inside a kind of permanent storm. Consider the geometry of it. This was a narrow place, hard against the dividing line. From the south, across that line, enemy artillery could reach them, the long guns firing across the divide. From the sea, naval gunfire came in, the heavy shells of warships standing off the coast. And from above, the aircraft came, the fighter bombers and the reconnaissance planes, day and night, watching and striking. Fire from the land, fire from the water, fire from the sky. The regiment was caught in the middle of all three, and into this, they had to bring their fragile, complicated, enormous missile system. And they had to set it up in the open, and they had to make it work. The reconnaissance aircraft were a particular torment. They circled overhead, searching, photographing, hunting for exactly the kind of installation the regiment was trying to build. A missile site is not easy to hide. The launchers are large. The radar vans emit signals that can be detected. The moment the enemy located a site, the fire would come down on it. So the men worked under constant observation, knowing that to be seen was to be struck, racing to prepare their positions before the watching eyes above could call down destruction. They set up at an agricultural settlement.
a state farm whose name carried, with bitter irony, the word for victory. Around them, the land was worked by people who had themselves learned to live under bombardment, who farmed and survived in the gaps between the falling shells. The regiment dug in among them and began the dangerous work of readying itself to fight. The losses came at once, and they came in a particular, demoralizing form.
The cruelest thing about this phase was not simply that men died. Men had been dying since the road. The cruelest thing was that the regiment kept being struck before it could strike back. Their equipment, the precious, irreplaceable equipment they had hauled across all those miles, was being destroyed on the ground. There was a night at the end of August in 1967 when one of the battalions had much of its equipment ruined by an enemy missile. Think about what that does to a unit. All the effort to bring that equipment forward, all the men who died protecting the column, and then, in a single strike, the tools themselves are wrecked before they have fired in anger at the target they came for. Earlier in the summer, another battalion had been knocked out of the fight entirely when the enemy put a missile down onto its position. An entire firing unit removed from the board, not by losing a duel with the bomber, but by being found and hit first. And the toll on the men kept climbing. By the early part of September, the regiment had suffered hundreds of casualties across its ranks. Hundreds. The commander of the regiment himself was wounded. And in one especially painful loss, a number of missiles, 15 of them, were destroyed before they could even be raised onto their launchers. 15 missiles, each one a hard-won, irreplaceable weapon, gone without ever leaving the ground. This is the part of the story that the eventual triumph can obscure. We know, because we are telling this tale, that a victory is coming. But the men living through that summer did not know it. They knew only the steady arithmetic of loss, equipment destroyed, comrades killed, a battalion eliminated, the commander wounded, missiles wrecked in their crates. Every week seemed to subtract something from a force that had already given so much just to arrive. How does a unit survive that? Not just physically, but in spirit. At what point does an accumulation of failure become a thing that breaks the will to continue? It is worth dwelling here on the psychology of sustained loss, because it is one of the least understood aspects of war. We celebrate the courage of the decisive moment. We are less comfortable with the harder, grayer courage of the long defeat. The courage required simply to remain a functioning unit when every indicator says you are losing. The men of this regiment had not yet won anything in the South. They had only lost, again and again. And still, somehow, they held together. Part of what held them, surely, was leadership. Not the dramatic kind that inspires with grand speeches, but the steadier kind that keeps a unit organized when chaos presses in from every side. Someone had to decide where to place the surviving equipment. Someone had to keep the training going even as the losses mounted. Someone had to look at a battered, bleeding regiment and see, not a lost cause, but a tool that could still be made to work if it were only used correctly. And here we arrive at the decision that would change everything. Faced with a regiment ground down by months of attrition, with equipment destroyed and battalions weakened, the leadership made a choice that was either desperate or brilliant, and was probably both. They looked at what remained. Scattered across the regiment were the surviving pieces of equipment, some damaged, some intact, some better than others. Spread thin across multiple battalions, none of them was at full strength. None of them, in its weakened state, was truly ready to take on the hardest target imaginable. So the leadership decided to stop spreading their strength thin. They decided to gather it. The plan was as simple to state as it was bold to attempt. Take the best of everything the regiment had left.
the best equipment, the best surviving gear. Consolidate it all into a single battalion. Concentrate the regiment's diminished strength into one sharp point. One unit brought up to full fighting power by stripping the others. And aim that single battalion at the one target that justified the whole campaign. Make one battalion whole at the cost of the rest. Then send it to do the thing the entire regiment had crossed all those miles to do. The battalion they chose to carry this weight had a number. It was the 84th, and the decision to pour everything into it would either vindicate the long catalog of suffering, or it would prove that suffering had been for nothing. There is a logic in war that civilians rarely have to confront. It is the logic of concentration, and it is brutal in its honesty. When you are strong everywhere, you can afford to spread your strength. You can defend many points, attempt many things, accept losses in one place because you have reserves in another. But when you are weak, when attrition has ground you down, that luxury vanishes. You face a hard arithmetic. You can be weak everywhere, defending nothing well, attempting everything and accomplishing nothing. Or you can choose. You can take what little you have and gather it into a single fist.
Accepting that everywhere else you will now be weaker still, in exchange for being strong in one place, at one moment, against one target that matters more than all the rest. That is the choice the regiment's leadership made. They chose the fist. It is easy to say. It was agonizing to do. To consolidate the best equipment into one battalion meant deliberately weakening the others. It meant looking at units full of men who had bled across the same roads, who had survived the same bombardment, and telling them, in effect, that their equipment, their readiness, their chance at the decisive blow, would be given to someone else. The 84th would be made whole. The others would give up pieces of themselves to make it so. Soldiers understand sacrifice for a cause. But there is a particular sting in being the one asked to step back so that another may strike. The men who gave up their equipment did not get to be the ones who fired the historic shot. They became, in a sense, the foundation that someone else would stand on. That kind of contribution is real. And it is honorable. And it is almost always forgotten by history, which remembers the hand that pulls the trigger and not the hands that loaded the weapon. So let us not forget them. The victory that was coming did not belong only to one battalion. It was built on the stripped-down strength of an entire regiment. On the equipment surrendered by units that would not get the glory. On the long ledger of the dead who never saw the result of what their deaths had purchased.
When the 84th finally fired, it fired with the gathered strength of all of them. Now, why the 84th? This was the same battalion that, on the long road south more than a year earlier, had brought down those 2 American attack jets. It had tasted success. Its crews had proven, in that early engagement, that they could find a target and kill it. There was, in that battalion, a thread of confidence running back to a real victory. And confidence is not a small thing when you are about to ask men to do something that has never been done. The leadership poured the regiment's best into this proven unit, the strongest equipment, the most reliable gear. They reinforced its training, drilling the crews specifically on the problem of the bomber, hammering at the techniques that might, just might, let them see through the storm of jamming and find the great aircraft hidden inside it. And they placed it all under a battalion commander whose name we should now speak. He was the man who would carry the decision on his shoulders when the moment came. The battalion commander directing the 84th in this period was a man named Nguyen Phien. Command at that level, in that situation, is a particular kind of burden. Phien was not a general moving units on a map far from the fighting. He was there, with his crews, in the immediate presence of the danger. When the bomber came, the decision to fire, the judgment about whether the shape in the storm was real, the responsibility for spending the battalion's precious few missiles on the right target at the right instant, all of it would come down through him. Imagine the weight of that.
You command the one battalion into which an entire suffering regiment has poured its last, best strength. You know how much has been spent to give you this chance. You know that your missiles are few and irreplaceable, that every one you fire at a phantom is one you will not have for the real thing. You know that the eyes of your superiors, and in a sense, the whole long effort going back to that early prediction, rest on what you and your crew do in the few seconds you will have. That is not a weight most people could carry. The men who can carry it are rare, and they are not always the ones you would expect. They are not necessarily the loudest or the most fearless. Often, they are the steadiest. The ones who can hold a clear head when everything around them is chaos and pressure, who can make a hard call in a heartbeat and live with it afterward. The crew that would serve under Phien in the decisive engagement were specialists, each with a precise role in the intricate dance of finding and killing an aircraft. There was the guidance officer, the man responsible for the targeting solution. There were the operators who worked the tracking, the ones who would have to wrestle meaning out of that snow-filled screen. Each was a craftsman in his own narrow, vital art. Together, they formed a single instrument, and that instrument was about to be tested against the hardest problem it would ever face. But all the consolidation, all the reinforcement, all the steady leadership in the world could not solve the central problem on its own. The 84th was now strong. It was whole. It was well led and well drilled. And it still could not see the bomber. Because the bomber, when it came, would still be wrapped in that cloud of electronic noise. The screens would still fill with false light. All the strength gathered into this one battalion would mean nothing if, in the critical seconds, the crew could not pull the real aircraft out of the storm of lies. So the final piece of the puzzle was not about strength at all. It was about perception. It was about a technique, a way of reading the chaos that would let a human being find the truth hidden inside the jamming. The men of the regiment had a name for what they were trying to do. It was a vivid, almost poetic phrase, and it described the single hardest skill in the entire campaign. Cut through the jamming. Find the foe inside it. That technique, and the human minds that had to execute it under unimaginable pressure, would decide everything. Picture the screen one more time. The storm of false light. The blizzard of interference poured into the air by the bomber and its escorts. Every flake a lie, designed to hide the one truth that matters. Now imagine being told that your job is to look into that storm and find the truth anyway. Not with a computer that does it for you, not with some clever automatic filter, with your own eyes, your own trained judgment, your own ability to perceive a pattern that the enemy has spent enormous effort to bury. That was the skill. The men called it, in their own language, by a phrase that translates to something like cutting through the jamming to find the enemy. Strip away the noise, locate the foe within it. It sounds almost mystical. It was not. It was a craft learned through punishing repetition. And to understand it, you have to understand a little about how the jamming worked and why it was so hard to defeat. When the bomber wanted to hide from a guidance radar, it did not become invisible in any simple sense. Instead, it also became, and the aircraft around it, broadcast energy on the frequencies the radar used. To the operator watching the screen, the clean blip of a tracked aircraft would dissolve into a wide smear of light.
a band of interference that washed out the precise return the system needed to guide a missile. The radar could tell that something was out there. It could not, in the face of strong jamming, tell exactly where. It was as if someone had taken a single bright star and surrounded it with a wall of glare so intense that you could no longer say precisely where the star was. You knew the direction, roughly. You could not get the pinpoint fix that a missile demanded. The breakthrough, such as it was, lay in learning to read the jamming itself as information. The smear of interference was not random. It had a shape, a behavior, a way of moving across the screen as the aircraft producing it moved through the sky. A trained operator, one who had stared into that storm 1,000 times, could begin to perceive the source of the jamming within the jamming. The very effort the enemy made to hide became, to the right eyes, a kind of signature. The thickest part of the smear, the way it tracked, the subtle structure inside the chaos, all of it could be read by someone patient and skilled enough.
This is one of the great ironies of electronic warfare, and it runs through the whole history of the contest between detection and concealment. The act of hiding can itself be detectable. The jamming meant to blind the radar became to operators who learned this craft the very thing that pointed at the target. The bomber was shouting noise to hide, and the noise, read correctly, said, "Here I am." But learning to read it was not a matter of cleverness alone. It was a matter of endless, grinding practice, much of it under fire, much of it paid for in the equipment and lives we have already counted. Every engagement that went wrong taught a lesson. Every near miss refined the technique. The men were, as we said earlier, writing a manual that did not yet exist. And this skill, this ability to cut through the jamming and find the foe, was its central, hardest chapter. Now place a human being at the center of that. Not an abstraction, a young man sitting in a dark vehicle, in a place under constant bombardment, knowing that his unit has bled for over a year to bring him to this screen. He has been drilled until the technique is nearly instinct. And still, when the real bomber comes, wrapped in real jamming, with real missiles ready, and the whole weight of the campaign pressing down, he must perform. The psychology of that moment deserves our attention. We talk easily about pressure, but this was pressure of a rare and concentrated kind. Consider what was riding on this small crew. The missiles were few. We know that at the decisive moment they would have only a handful of shots, and that toward the end of the engagement they would be down to a single missile. There was no margin for waste. A shot fired at a phantom, at a false reading pulled wrongly out of the storm, was a shot gone forever, and possibly the difference between triumph and another bitter failure. So the guidance officer and the tracking operators carried not just the technical challenge, but the knowledge of scarcity. Every decision was final. Every judgment about what was real in that storm was a judgment they could not take back. And they had to make those judgments in seconds, against an aircraft moving fast and high, in conditions designed specifically to deceive them. How does a person function under that kind of weight? The answer, again, is training. The deep kind that lets skill operate even when fear floods the body. Fear does not vanish in such men. It is there. The hands may want to shake. The mind may want to freeze. What training does is build a channel through which the trained action can still flow, even with the fear present. The crew did not need to be unafraid. They needed to be able to do their jobs while afraid. And that is a far more human and achievable kind of courage than the fearlessness of legend. There is also something to be said about the focus that a screen like that demands. In the moment of engagement, the rest of the world falls away. The bombardment, the danger to one's own life,
the larger meaning of it all, the year of loss behind. None of it can be in the mind. There was only the storm of light and the search for the truth inside it. That narrowing of attention is its own kind of refuge, in the act of doing the work. The terror has no room to live. The commander, Phien, carried a different weight in those same seconds. His was the burden of decision. His crew would find the target, or believe they had found it, and present him with a judgment. And he would have to say yes or no, fire or hold, spend a precious missile or save it. He had to trust his crew's reading of the storm enough to act on it, while knowing that they, like all humans, could be wrong. This is the true texture of command in combat. It is not the grand gesture. It is the willingness to make an irreversible decision on imperfect information in a sliver of time, and to own whatever follows. Phien would have that moment, and when it came, he would not hesitate. But before the decision, before the firing, there was the waiting. The long, taut waiting of a unit at its highest alert, knowing the bomber was coming, not knowing the exact instant. Every nerve stretched toward the sky. On a particular afternoon, that waiting would end. The order would come to go to the highest state of readiness. And then, in the space of barely half an hour, everything the regiment had suffered, learned, and sacrificed for would be put to the only test that ever truly mattered. 1 in the afternoon, the order comes down. The battalion goes to its highest state of readiness. From this moment, time changes its character. For more than a year, the story has moved across months and miles. The slow grind of road and bombardment and loss. Now it compresses. Now it lives in minutes, and then in seconds.
The whole long campaign has been narrowing toward this afternoon, like a river narrowing toward a falls. And at 1 in the afternoon, the current quickens past the point of return. At the highest alert, everything in the battalion is poised. The crews are at their stations. The equipment, the best the regiment could gather, is warmed and ready. The missiles, few and precious, wait on their launchers. Somewhere to the south, beyond sight, the bombers are coming, lifting off from a distant island base, droning north toward this narrow strip of contested land with their heavy loads, wrapped in their cloud of electronic noise. The hours between the alert and the engagement are their own kind of trial. To be at maximum readiness is to be stretched taut, unable to relax, unable to act, suspended in pure anticipation. The mind plays its tricks. Is this the day? Will they come? Will the jamming be too strong? Will the months of preparation prove enough? Or will this be one more bitter lesson written in lost missiles and the silence of a target that slipped away? Inside the guidance vehicle, the crew waits with their screen. The guidance officer, the tracking operators, each in his place, each rehearsing in his mind the technique they have drilled until it lives in the body. Cut through the jamming. Find the foe inside it. They have done it in practice, against simulated noise, against the lesser challenges of ordinary aircraft. Now they wait to do it against the real thing, the great bomber itself, the target the whole campaign exists to destroy. And the commander, Phien, waits with the heaviest burden of all. The decision is coming toward him through the afternoon air, and he cannot rush it, and he cannot avoid it.
He can only be ready to meet it when it arrives. The afternoon stretches on. The light shifts. And then, in the early evening, it begins. The screens come alive with the storm. The bombers are entering range, and with them comes the jamming, the flood of false light the crews have trained their whole campaign to defeat. This is the moment. This is the test. Everything is now. The operators bend to their screens and begin the work. Strip away the noise. Read the storm. Find the structure inside the chaos. the signature of the source, the truth the enemy is shouting to hide. Seconds pass that feel like nothing and like forever at once. The technique, the craft paid for in over a year of blood, is now flowing through trained hands and trained eyes. They find it, inside the storm. They find the foe. The targeting solution comes together. The judgment is made. The shape in the storm is real, and it is passed to the commander, and the commander does not hesitate. At 3 minutes past 5 in the evening, the order is given. 2 missiles leave their launchers. 2. Out of the few the battalion has. A heavy commitment, spent in an instant, climbing into the evening sky toward a target the eye cannot see and the screen has only just managed to find. The missiles ride their guidance up through the air, up toward the great machine wrapped in its noise. And for a few seconds, the entire campaign hangs on whether the crew read the storm correctly, whether the solution was true, whether the long apprenticeship has finally produced its answer. It had. Far off, an observation post reports an aircraft burning, falling toward the coast, toward the mouth of a river to the south. And about half an hour later, soldiers on an island off the coast confirm it. A great aircraft burning, plunging into the sea. The bomber, the untouchable bomber, brought down out of the evening sky by missiles guided through the storm by human eyes and human nerve. Sit with that for a moment. After all of it, after the prediction made years before, after the long road south and the 16 dead in a single day, after the battalion knocked out, the equipment destroyed on the ground, the 15 missiles wrecked before they could fly, the hundreds of casualties, the wounded commander, the agonizing decision to strip a whole regiment to make one battalion whole. After all of that, the thing they were told could not be done had just been done. The storm had been read. The foe had been found. The bomber had fallen. But the afternoon was not finished. At 34 minutes past 5, barely half an hour after the first engagement, another group of bombers came on. And here the story tightens to its most extraordinary point. The battalion had spent 2 of its precious missiles on the first kill. Now, facing a fresh target, it had almost nothing left. By the accounts that come down to us, the battalion was down to a single missile. 1. Think about the choice in that moment. 1 missile, a fresh bomber entering range, wrapped in the same storm of jamming. Every instinct of caution would say, hold, save it. Do not throw away your last shot on a hard target you may not hit. But that is not what they did. The decision was made to fight on, to spend the last missile, to attempt with 1 shot what most would not attempt with several. They fired, and the second bomber fell.
1 missile, 1 more of the great aircraft brought down in barely half an hour with a handful of missiles gathered from a battered regiment. The battalion had done twice what no one had managed to do even once. We should be careful here and honest, because honesty is the whole point of telling this well. What I have just described is the account as it was recorded and remembered by the men who were there and the nation they fought for. It is detailed, specific, and consistent in its broad shape across the sources that preserve it. The times, the missiles, the sequence, the observation post confirming the burning aircraft. All of it comes down to us through that record. And yet there is another set of records, kept on the other side of that evening sky. That does not tell the same story. To understand this event fully, to honor the truth rather than just the triumph, we have to set those 2 records beside each other and look honestly at where they agree and where they do not. Because the men in the missile pits were certain of what they had done. The question of what the other side's documents say, and why the 2 accounts diverge, is not a flaw in this story. It is part of it.
Here we have to slow down and tell a harder kind of truth. Not the truth of triumph, but the truth of how history actually comes down to us, which is messier and more honest, and in its own way more interesting than any clean victory. The men of the battalion were certain, by their account, on that evening, 2 great bombers fell from the sky in the space of barely half an hour.
The record they kept and passed down is specific and consistent. The alert at 1 in the afternoon. The first 2 missiles at 3 minutes past 5. The aircraft burning toward the coast. The confirmation from the observation post. And then from the soldiers on the island off the shore who saw the burning machine plunge into the sea. The second engagement at 34 minutes past 5. The last single missile. The second aircraft falling. This is not a vague legend. It is a detailed account, remembered by people who were there, preserved by the nation they served. And on the other side of that sky, the records do not match. The documents kept by the American side, the careful accounting of which bombers were lost and when, do not record the loss of a B-52 on that day. According to those records, the first B-52 confirmed shot down by this kind of missile came years later, in the great air battles over the northern cities at the very end of 1972. By that accounting, no such bomber was lost on this September evening in 1967 at all. So we have 2 records that cannot both be simply, completely true as stated. One side remembers 2 bombers falling. The other side records none lost that day. What do we do with that? The first thing we do is resist the easy temptations. The easy temptation in one direction is to wave away the men in the missile pits, to say they must have been mistaken, that they saw what they wanted to see, that the burning aircraft was something else or nothing at all. The easy temptation in the other direction is to dismiss the other side's records as a cover-up, to assume the loss was simply hidden. Both of those are too easy.
Both reach for a simple answer, where the honest response is to admit we are looking at a genuine divergence in the historical record. What can be said with confidence is this: the campaign was real. The regiment's suffering was real, documented on both the road and the killing ground. The technique of cutting through the jamming was real and would prove its worth. The men's belief that they had brought down the bomber was sincere and specific, and the other side's records, kept for their own purposes with their own rigor, tell a different story about that particular day. History is full of these divergences, and they are most common precisely in moments like this one: an engagement at the edge of evening, a target that the eye could not see, found only as a reading on a screen wrapped in interference. An aircraft reported burning and falling far away, confirmed by observers at a distance, in conditions of war where certainty is the rarest commodity of all. When you fire missiles into a storm of jamming at a target you cannot directly see, and an aircraft is reported to fall miles away, the chain between your action and the result is long, and every link in it is vulnerable to the fog that settles over every battlefield. This is not a comfortable place to leave a story. We would prefer the clean version. We would prefer the records to agree, the triumph to be unambiguous, the moment to be settled for all time. But the discomfort is the honest place, and a channel that cares about truth has to be willing to sit in it. What matters, and what is not in dispute, is what this moment meant to the people who lived it, and what grew out of it. Whatever the precise tally of aircraft on that single evening, the men of the regiment came away believing they had cracked the problem. They came away with the conviction that the bomber could be found inside the storm and brought down. And, crucially, they came away with a body of hard-won technique, refined through more than a year of loss, that they could write down and teach to others. That, in the end, may be the most important thing to carry out of this story. Not a number of aircraft, which the records will argue over forever, but
but a method, a way of fighting, a confidence earned at great cost, that the untouchable was not untouchable after all. There is a deeper point here about how the truth of war gets made and remembered. Each side keeps its own account, shaped by what it could see, what it needed to believe, and what it chose to record. Neither account is simply propaganda, and neither is simply objective fact. They are both human documents, made by people trying to make sense of chaos from their own position inside it. The honest historian does not pick the version that flatters one side. The honest historian holds both, names the gap between them, and tells you plainly that the gap is there, and we should hold too. The human reality on both sides of that evening. If bombers fell, then there were young men in those aircraft whose lives ended or changed forever in those minutes. Men who had families waiting far away. Men who were doing what their nation asked just as surely as the men in the missile pits below.
And if the records on the other side are right, that no bomber was lost that day, then there were crews who flew through those missiles and lived, never knowing how close the storm below had come to finding them. Either way, there were human beings in that sky, and human beings on that ground, and the distance between them was filled with fear and noise and the terrible machinery of war. What is certain is that the regiment's long apprenticeship did not end in vain. The technique survived, the belief survived, and both would travel forward in time, carried by the men who had learned them at such cost, toward a reckoning years later in the skies over the north, where the great bombers would come in numbers no one had yet imagined, and where the lessons learned on this killing ground would finally be written across the heavens for all to see. The echo of this evening was not finished. It was only beginning to travel. Let us draw out what this long, costly story has to teach. Not platitudes, but lessons that grew from this specific ground, paid for by these specific men. The first lesson is about preparation against a threat that has not yet arrived. The whole effort began with a prediction, a belief that the great bomber would one day come, and a decision to start the work of defeating it years before it did. That is rare. Most people, most institutions, wait for the crisis to arrive before they begin to solve it. By then, it is usually too late. The regiment was sent forward to study a problem that was still mostly theoretical. It had befell them to fail at it over and over in conditions of real danger, so that when the threat became real on a larger scale, the answer would already exist. There is a hard wisdom in that. The time to learn how to fight a thing is before it is fully upon you, when failure is still survivable. The second lesson is about concentration in weakness. When the regiment had been ground down, when it was weak everywhere, its leaders did not try to be adequate at every point. They gathered their diminished strength into a single battalion, accepting weakness elsewhere to achieve real power in one place. This is one of the oldest principles in the art of war, and one of the hardest to actually do, because it means deliberately giving up on most of your front to win at one point. It requires the discipline to choose and the nerve to live with what you have chosen. The third lesson is the strangest and the most beautiful. It is that the enemy's effort to hide became the very thing that revealed him. The jamming meant to blind the radar, read by patient and skilled eyes, became the signature that pointed at the target. There is something in that worth carrying far beyond this battlefield. Often the thing an adversary does to conceal himself, the noise he makes to cover his presence, is itself a kind of signal, if only you learn to read it. The men called their technique cutting through the jamming to find the foe. It is also a lesson about perception itself. What looks like impenetrable chaos may,
to a trained and patient mind, contained the very truth it was meant to hide. And there is a fourth thing, quieter than the others, that I do not want to pass over. It is the lesson of the unglamorous dead. The 16 killed in a single day on the road, not in any climactic battle, but in the simple, grinding work of moving forward under fire. The battalion knocked out before it could strike. The 15 missiles destroyed in their crates. The men of other battalions who gave up their equipment so that one battalion could be made whole, and who never got to fire the historic shot. History remembers the hand that pulls the trigger. It forgets the hundreds of hands that carried the weapon to that place. We should try to remember them, because the victory, whatever its true shape, was built on all of them. Now let me close. The bombers that may have fallen that evening, and the campaign that brought them down, are remembered today as a beginning. The technique survived. The belief survived. Years later, when the great bombers came against the northern cities in overwhelming numbers, the lessons learned on that narrow strip of bombarded land were ready, written into a method that others could use. What had been attempted by a single battered battalion became, in time, the practice of an entire air defense force, and the sky over the capital filled with the consequences of what these men had learned at such cost. But I want to end not with the strategic arc, which the records will go on debating, but with the human one, which does not depend on any tally. Think of the young man at the screen where we began, the storm of false light falling across the glass, the whole weight of a campaign pressing on the few seconds in which he must find the truth inside the noise. He did not know how history would remember this evening. He did not know whether the records of the other side would agree with his own. He knew only the work in front of him, the trained search through chaos, the irreversible decision, the missile climbing toward a thing he could not see. On every side of that evening sky, there were people like him, men in the missile pits straining to perceive, men in the cockpits high above, wrapped in their own fear, doing what they had been sent to do. None of them chose the war. Most of them were young. All of them carried, somewhere behind the discipline and the noise, a life they hoped to return to. What endures is not the number of aircraft. It is that human beings, on a small and terrible patch of ground, faced something they were told could not be overcome, and refused to accept it, and paid for that refusal in blood, and in the end, changed what was thought possible. That is the thing worth remembering, not the triumph alone, and not the dispute over the count, but the long, stubborn, costly human effort to find the truth inside the storm.